The blizzard came without warning that winter, burying the northern outpost under sheets of white so thick that the horizon disappeared entirely. For 11 days the base had been cut off, surrounded on 3 sides by enemy positions, its supply lines choked by snow and silence. The soldiers stationed there had grown thin, tired, and short-tempered, counting the hours until the next helicopter might break through the storm. When the final resupply aircraft finally descended through the churning gray sky, every exhausted face turned toward it with something between relief and desperation. What stepped off that helicopter, however, was not what any of them expected. She was small, almost impossibly small for a place built on brute endurance and frozen violence. Her frame barely filled her winter gear. Her boots looked 2 sizes too large, and the wind seemed to bend around her rather than through her. She said nothing as she stepped onto the ice-covered landing strip. She carried only a worn canvas backpack and a long, narrow case slung across her shoulder, its shape unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough winters in that valley. The soldiers gathered near the landing zone exchanged glances, then laughter, low and disbelieving. The kind of laughter men use when they are tired and frightened and need something to mock. One private guessed she was the new medic. Another insisted she had to be an interpreter sent from command, perhaps someone's niece pulling strings for a safer post. A grizzled supply sergeant joked that she was probably an accountant sent to audit their ammunition records, since surely no one would send someone that size to hold a rifle position on the coldest ridge in the entire sector. The laughter grew louder when the base commander, a weathered officer named Colonel Walter Briggs, read the transfer orders aloud and confirmed what none of them wanted to believe. She was their new sniper, assigned directly from the highest levels of command, with orders that could not be questioned or reversed. The reaction was immediate and merciless. A sergeant named Marcus Doyle, broad-shouldered and twice her height, shook his head and muttered that the girl would not survive a single day on the ridge, let alone a winter siege. Other voices joined his, some cruel, some simply skeptical, all convinced that command had made some clerical error or worse, that someone back at headquarters was playing a political favor with soldiers' lives. Colonel Briggs wanted to object as well, but the orders bore a seal he had never seen used before, one that silenced even his objections before he could voice them. He had commanded long enough to know that some directives were not open for debate, no matter how absurd they appeared on the surface. The base itself had been carved into the side of a frozen ridge years earlier, its bunkers reinforced against artillery but never truly built to withstand the kind of prolonged isolation the winter had forced upon it. Generators ran on rationed fuel. Meals had grown thin and repetitive. Morale had eroded slowly over the preceding weeks, worn down not by any single catastrophe, but by the accumulated weight of cold, hunger, and uncertainty pressing against every soldier stationed there. Into that fragile atmosphere, her arrival landed like a small stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into laughter that some men needed simply to feel less afraid. Through all of it, she said nothing. She did not defend herself, did not explain her presence, did not so much as glance toward the men laughing behind gloved hands. She simply lifted her rifle case, walked past them all, without a flicker of expression, and asked one question only, quietly, to the corporal assigned to escort her. Which position was the highest on the ridge? When he pointed toward the exposed outpost that even veteran snipers avoided during storms, the coldest, most dangerous perch in the entire sector, she nodded once and began walking toward it without hesitation. That night, as the wind howled against the metal walls of the barracks, the soldiers traded theories about the strange young woman now stationed above them in the storm. Some said she had been sent as punishment for someone back home. Others joked that command had simply run out of real snipers. None of them noticed that she had already disappeared into the whiteout, climbing alone toward a position where the temperature would fall low enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. None of them yet understood that her silence was not fear, and her smallness was not weakness, and that the laughter echoing through the barracks that evening would soon feel like the loudest mistake any of them had ever made. In the days that followed, the mockery softened into something closer to bewilderment. Every morning before the gray light of dawn touched the ridge, she climbed to her position alone, moving through snow that reached her knees as though it were nothing more than damp grass. She would remain there for hours, sometimes the entire day, watching the valley below through her scope without ever firing a single round. She never radioed in a report. She never requested relief. She rarely spoke to anyone at all, and when she did, her words were so brief that most of the men simply gave up trying to draw her into conversation. A veteran marksman named Corporal Danny Ruiz, who had spent 3 winters on that same ridge, began to grumble that the newcomer did not even understand basic targeting discipline. He complained to anyone who would listen that she seemed to stare at empty snowfields for hours without ever locking onto anything resembling a target, as though she had wandered up there simply to escape the barracks rather than to do her job. Others began to whisper that perhaps the rumors were true after all, that she had been sent to this remote posting because she had failed somewhere else, or because someone powerful wanted her far away from wherever she had come from. What none of them witnessed were her nights. Long after the base had gone dark and the men had retreated into whatever warmth they could find, she remained awake in her small quarters, hunched over a notebook filled with numbers and diagrams that would have meant nothing to anyone who saw them. She measured wind patterns from data no one else bothered to collect. She sketched detailed maps of the valley, marking elevation changes, tree lines, and drainage paths with a precision that bordered on obsession. She recorded humidity readings, barometric shifts, and temperature gradients across different hours of the day, cross-referencing them against angles and distances that stretched far beyond what any training manual considered practical. She was not simply watching the valley, she was learning it, memorizing every contour and current of air that moved through it, building a mental map so complete that she could calculate a bullet's path across distances that would defeat lesser marksmen before they ever pulled a trigger. No one on the base understood what she was preparing for, because no one thought to ask what kind of mind would need that much information before firing a single shot. They saw only a strange, silent girl scribbling in notebooks by candlelight, and they assumed, as tired men often do, that stillness meant emptiness rather than depth. Even the wind seemed to behave differently around her position, or so claimed the men who watched from a distance through frosted binoculars, unwilling to admit how closely they had begun tracking her every movement despite their earlier contempt. Some began keeping their own private tallies of her habits, noting the hour she climbed the ridge, the hour she descended, the strange, unhurried rhythm of a person who never once seemed rushed by the cold that drove lesser soldiers indoors within minutes. A quiet unease had begun to settle over the barracks, the kind that comes not from fear of an enemy but from the slow, uncomfortable realization that something long dismissed might have been badly misjudged from the very beginning. It was a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Sarah Kane who first noticed the irregularity that would trouble her for weeks afterward. While processing personnel files for a routine security audit, she discovered that the new sniper's records had been sealed under a classification level she had never encountered in her entire career, one that required authorization far above the base commander's own clearance. When she brought the anomaly to Colonel Briggs, he stared at the file for a long moment before quietly closing it and telling her to let the matter rest. Whatever secrets that sealed record contained, they were secrets someone far above them had decided the base did not need to know, at least not yet. The first major assault came on a night thick with driving snow, when visibility dropped to almost nothing and the temperature plummeted well below anything the soldiers had endured that winter. Enemy drones appeared first, buzzing low over the ridge like insects testing the perimeter before the real attack began. Then came the artillery, distant thunder rolling across the valley floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of ground forces advancing under cover of the storm. Every sniper on the ridge opened fire the moment shapes emerged from the whiteout, tracer rounds slicing through the darkness in controlled, practiced bursts. Every sniper except her. She remained motionless at her position, scope pressed to her eye, finger resting outside the trigger guard, watching the chaos unfold below without firing a single round. Soldiers nearby began shouting at her over the radio, demanding to know why she was not engaging, accusing her of freezing under pressure exactly as they had always suspected she would. Corporal Ruiz screamed into his radio that the newcomer had lost her nerve entirely. That command needed to pull her off the ridge before her cowardice cost them the position. Colonel Briggs, watching from the command post, began drafting the order to relieve her on the spot. Then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, an enemy commander rose briefly from behind a snowbank to direct his advancing troops forward, exposing himself for less than 2 seconds in conditions that made accurate targeting almost impossible for any ordinary marksman. A single shot rang out from the ridge, cutting through wind and snow and distance that should have made the attempt nearly suicidal in its improbability. The bullet found its mark with impossible precision, and the enemy commander collapsed instantly into the snow, his final orders dying with him before they ever reached his men. The effect was immediate and devastating. Without their commander's direction, the advancing enemy formation fractured into confusion, soldiers hesitating, colliding with one another, uncertain whether to press forward or retreat. The assault stalled just long enough for the base's defenses to regroup and repel the attack entirely, driving the disorganized enemy forces back into the storm from which they had come. When the shooting finally stopped and the soldiers turned to look toward the ridge, expecting some triumphant explanation, they found only the same silent figure they had mocked days earlier, already lowering her rifle without a word of celebration or justification. She offered no report that night, no explanation of how she had calculated a shot that seasoned marksmen would have considered nearly impossible under those conditions. She simply returned to her position and resumed her patient, wordless watch over the valley, as though the moment that had just saved the base meant nothing more to her than any other action she had taken that week. The soldiers who had laughed loudest just days before now found themselves standing in stunned silence, uncertain how to reconcile the image of the girl they had dismissed with the impossible shot that had just unfolded before their eyes. In the days following that first engagement, the silence around her deepened rather than broke. Everyone expected her to fire again, to press whatever advantage she had demonstrated, to finish what she had started with the kind of aggressive momentum that command always seemed to want from its snipers. Instead, she simply returned to the ridge each morning and resumed her quiet, patient observation, refusing to fire even when smaller targets presented themselves within easy range. 3 days passed without another shot, then 4. The frustration among the ranks began to boil over into open anger. Captain James Holloway, growing increasingly impatient with what he perceived as reckless restraint, finally confronted her directly, demanding to know why she refused to eliminate targets that any competent marksman would have taken without hesitation. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable beneath layers of frost and exhaustion, and said only that not every target was worth the sound of a rifle. When he pressed further, demanding a real answer, she offered nothing more, turning back toward the valley as though the conversation had already ended in her mind long before it began for him. Holloway walked away from that exchange more frustrated than he had been in weeks, convinced that command had saddled him with a soldier either too proud or too fearful to justify her own choices under pressure. He complained privately to Colonel Briggs that discipline on the ridge was beginning to fray, that other marksmen were starting to question their own orders after watching hers go unpunished despite what looked, from the outside, like open insubordination. Briggs listened patiently, said little in response, and privately began wondering whether the frustration building around her might be less about her behavior and more about how uncomfortable it felt to serve alongside someone whose reasoning no one else could fully follow. It was a ballistics specialist named Sergeant Emily Whitfield who eventually uncovered the pattern that no one else on base had thought to examine. Reviewing after-action reports from the single shot fired days earlier, she noticed something that struck her as remarkable rather than merely lucky. The man killed that night had not been a random target of opportunity, but the specific field commander coordinating the entire assault, the one figure whose death would cause maximum disruption to enemy operations. It was not an act of desperation under fire. It was a calculated decision, made in seconds, to eliminate the single most valuable target available in that entire engagement. Whitfield began cross-referencing every hour the sniper spent on the ridge, comparing her long stretches of apparent inactivity against enemy radio intercepts and drone surveillance the base had gathered over the preceding weeks. What emerged from that analysis unsettled her more than she expected. The girl was not failing to identify targets during those long silent hours. She was identifying every target within range and then systematically choosing not to fire on nearly all of them, waiting instead for specific individuals whose value to the enemy's command structure justified breaking her silence. When Whitfield finally understood the pattern completely, she brought her findings to Colonel Briggs with something close to alarm in her voice. Every shot the young sniper had fired, and every shot she had deliberately withheld, formed a coherent strategy invisible to anyone thinking in terms of simple kill counts. She was not hunting soldiers, she was dismantling the nervous system of an entire military operation one carefully chosen shot at a time, targeting radar operators, drone pilots, and field commanders whose loss would cripple coordination far more effectively than 100 conventional casualties ever could. Briggs sat with that information for a long time before speaking, staring out at the storm still churning beyond his window toward the ridge where she remained at her post. He had commanded soldiers for over 20 years and had never encountered anyone who approached warfare with such surgical patience, treating restraint itself as a weapon more powerful than the rifle in her hands. He began to understand, slowly and with a growing unease he could not quite name, that whatever secrets remained sealed within her classified file, they likely explained far more than anyone on that base had yet imagined. The answer, when it finally came, arrived not through official channels but through memory. An aging officer stationed temporarily at the base, Colonel Robert Hale, happened to catch sight of her one evening as she descended from the ridge through the fading light, and something in the shape of her posture stopped him mid-step. He approached her carefully, studying her face for a long moment before speaking her name aloud, a name that had not been used in years, a name tied to a legend most soldiers of this generation had never heard properly told. She looked at him without surprise, as though she had expected this recognition eventually, from someone, somewhere, sooner or later. Her father, Colonel Hale, explained quietly to the small circle of officers who gathered once word spread, had been a legendary marksman named Thomas Carver, a man whose reputation in earlier conflicts bordered on myth among those who had served alongside him. Thomas Carver had died years earlier while protecting a group of trapped soldiers during an ambush in terrain not unlike the valley that now surrounded this very base, sacrificing the shot that might have saved himself in order to save the men pinned down beside him. His daughter had been young then, barely into her teenage years, and had learned of his death not through comforting words, but through the cold finality of a folded flag placed into her hands. She had said almost nothing in the years that followed, according to those who remembered her from that time, retreating into a silence that some mistook for grief and others recognized as something closer to purpose. She trained relentlessly, alone at first and then under increasingly specialized instruction, firing what military records later suggested amounted to millions of rounds across a decade of preparation that most recruits could not have endured for a single year. She spent thousands of hours in conditions designed to replicate the worst extremes of cold, wind, and exhaustion, treating discomfort not as an obstacle, but as a variable to master completely. By the time she reached adulthood, she had quietly surpassed every recorded benchmark her father had once held, though almost no one outside a small circle of instructors ever learned of it. Her records were sealed deliberately, Colonel Hale explained, precisely because a marksman capable of what she could do became an immediate and valuable target for enemies who might seek to eliminate her before she ever reached a battlefield, or worse, to attempt to capture and exploit her abilities for their own purposes. Her silence, then, had never been a personal quirk or a symptom of trauma left unaddressed. It was a discipline chosen deliberately, a shield built from stillness in a world that too often mistook noise for strength. Colonel Hale recalled, with the careful precision of a man revisiting memories he had long tried to set aside, the funeral held for her father in a small chapel far from any battlefield, attended by a handful of soldiers who had served beside him, and a daughter who stood through the entire ceremony without shedding a single visible tear. He remembered thinking, even then, that her stillness carried something unnatural for a child her age, though he had not yet understood it as the beginning of a discipline rather than the absence of feeling. Years later, watching her file cross his desk during a routine transfer review, he had recognized her name immediately, though nothing in the sparse paperwork had prepared him for the scope of what she had since become. He explained to the gathered officers that her training had not followed any conventional path through military academies or standard marksmanship programs, but had instead been shaped by a small number of instructors who recognized early on that she possessed something rare enough to warrant unusual investment. She had studied ballistics alongside engineers, weather patterns alongside meteorologists, and human behavior alongside intelligence analysts, weaving disciplines together in a way that transformed her rifle into merely the final instrument of a much broader and more patient kind of preparation. It was this breadth, more than raw talent alone, that had allowed her to accomplish what she had during the siege, treating the entire valley as a single interconnected problem rather than a simple matter of distance and aim. The soldiers who heard this story that evening fell quiet, in a way the storm itself had never managed to accomplish. Men who had mocked her only days earlier now found themselves reconsidering every silent hour she had spent on that ridge, every withheld shot, every moment of apparent stillness that had, in fact, been calculation of the highest order. Sergeant Doyle, who had been among the loudest voices dismissing her upon arrival, said nothing at all that night, staring instead toward the darkened ridge where she remained at her post, indifferent to the story now spreading about her through the barracks below. The full weight of the enemy's intentions became clear on what would later be remembered as the longest night of that entire winter. Reconnaissance reports flooding into command painted a picture far more dire than anything the base had faced before, describing thousands of enemy troops massing along the valley's edge, supported by armored vehicles and swarms of reconnaissance drones circling just beyond visual range. Artillery batteries had repositioned closer than ever before, their coordinates suggesting a final, overwhelming assault designed to break the base entirely rather than merely probe its defenses as previous attacks had done. Communication lines began failing one by one as the storm intensified, cutting the base off from reinforcements that might otherwise have altered the balance of the coming fight. Supply routes, already strained from weeks of siege, collapsed entirely under renewed shelling that targeted the access roads with unsettling precision, as though the enemy had studied every weakness the base possessed and waited patiently for the perfect moment to exploit them all simultaneously. Ammunition reserves, carefully rationed for weeks, dwindled toward levels that made sustained defense increasingly unlikely without some kind of decisive intervention. Colonel Briggs gathered his remaining officers inside the command post as reports continued arriving, each one worse than the last, and began drafting contingency plans for an organized withdrawal that would abandon the position entirely rather than risk annihilation. It was, by every conventional military calculation available to him, the only responsible choice remaining. The base simply lacked the manpower, the ammunition, and the reinforcements necessary to survive an assault of the scale now bearing down upon it. And no amount of individual heroism seemed capable of altering that grim mathematical reality. Outside the command post, soldiers moved through the darkened corridors preparing for whatever came next, some quietly gathering personal belongings, others simply sitting in silence, unwilling to voice the fear that had settled over the entire base as reports of the approaching force continued arriving in grim succession. Sergeant Doyle found himself checking his rifle for the third time in an hour, not because it needed checking, but because the repetitive motion gave his hand something to do besides shake. Corporal Ruiz stood near a frosted window, staring out toward the ridge where the silent sniper still remained at her post, wondering, not for the first time that winter, whether the strange calm she carried might be the only thing standing between the base and complete annihilation. It was in the middle of these frantic preparations that someone noticed she had returned briefly from the ridge, moving through the command post with quiet purpose toward a storage locker that had remained untouched since her arrival weeks earlier. Inside it, sealed with markings that matched the same classified authorization attached to her original transfer orders, lay a case of specialized ammunition unlike anything the base's quartermaster had ever issued or even seen before. She lifted the case without a word of explanation, checked its contents methodically, and turned back toward the ridge as the storm outside continued gathering strength around the isolated outpost. For the first time since her arrival, something in her bearing had shifted, subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. The patient stillness she had maintained for weeks now carried a different quality entirely, less like waiting and more like readiness, the coiled calm of someone who understood precisely what the coming hours would demand of her. Colonel Briggs watched her disappear back into the whiteout and found himself, against every instinct built from decades of conventional strategy, quietly delaying the withdrawal order he had been prepared to issue only moments before. What followed that night would later be described in official reports with clinical brevity, though nothing about the words captured the strange, deliberate rhythm of what actually unfolded across those long, dark hours. The gunfire that began echoing from the ridge was not the rapid, desperate fire of a defender fighting for survival, but something measured and unhurried, each shot separated from the next by minutes rather than seconds, as though its author felt no particular urgency despite the overwhelming force advancing toward the base below. Yet with each carefully spaced shot, something critical failed within the enemy's advancing formation. A command vehicle, its officers struck through an opening no wider than a few inches, rolled to a halt, and never moved again. A radar installation, its dish and operator alike, silenced in the same instant, went dark and stayed dark for the remainder of the assault. A mobile missile system, guided by coordinates no one had realized she possessed, suffered damage to its targeting array that rendered it useless before it could fire a single round toward the base it had been positioned to destroy. The enemy's officers, scattered across positions they believed were concealed by distance and storm alike, began falling one after another in a pattern too precise to be coincidence, yet too spread out across the battlefield to identify a single point of origin. Radio chatter intercepted by the base's remaining communications equipment revealed a rising tide of confusion among enemy ranks, officers demanding to know where the attacks were coming from, subordinates reporting contradictory sightings from positions kilometers apart, none of them able to pinpoint the source of the devastation unfolding around them. By the deepest hours of that endless night, the enemy's coordinated assault had degenerated into something resembling chaos rather than warfare, formations breaking apart. As commanders lost contact with units they could no longer direct, vehicles stalling in confusion as their crews realized their command structure had simply ceased to function. What had begun as an overwhelming show of force capable of erasing the base entirely had transformed, shot by patient shot, into a disorganized retreat that no one on the enemy side seemed able to explain or halt. Inside the base, soldiers listened to the distant, irregular gunfire with a growing sense of disbelief, unable to reconcile the calm rhythm of those shots with the scale of destruction being reported over intercepted enemy channels. Colonel Briggs stood at the command post window for hours, watching the ridge where she remained alone against an entire advancing army, and found himself unable to look away even as exhaustion pulled at every part of him. Sergeant Doyle, positioned near the perimeter with his own rifle ready, later admitted that he had stopped bracing for an attack that never fully materialized against their walls, realizing somewhere in the small hours before dawn that whatever was happening on that ridge had already decided the outcome of the battle long before enemy soldiers could ever reach them. There was something almost unbearable, several officers later confided, about wading through a battle they could hear but not see, trusting entirely in a single figure whose methods none of them fully understood even after weeks of watching her work. Yet as the hours passed and the volume of enemy radio chatter grew increasingly desperate and disorganized, that trust hardened into something closer to certainty. Whatever she was doing out there in the storm, alone against odds that should have overwhelmed any ordinary defender, it was working exactly as she had clearly always intended it to. Dawn arrived slowly that morning, the storm finally breaking apart into thin gray light that revealed a valley utterly transformed from the battlefield it had been only hours before. Reconnaissance aircraft, cleared to fly for the first time in days, sent back images that left even seasoned analysts at command headquarters struggling to process the scale of what had occurred. Dozens of command positions lay destroyed or abandoned across the valley floor, their crews gone, their equipment silent, their coordinated assault reduced to scattered debris scattered across the melting snow. Ammunition depots that had supplied the enemy's entire offensive sat in smoldering ruin, their destruction so thorough that supply officers back at command initially suspected an airstrike no one had authorized or recorded. Entire formations that had advanced with confidence just hours earlier had withdrawn in complete disarray, leaving behind equipment, wounded, and a communications network so thoroughly disrupted that enemy command would spend days simply trying to determine what had actually happened to their forces that night. No one among the senior enemy leadership could offer any coherent account of how their overwhelming numerical advantage had evaporated so completely. Investigators sent to review the wreckage in the days that followed struggled to reconstruct a battlefield that made sense according to any conventional model of engagement, finding no evidence of the large opposing force or coordinated counterattack that would normally explain destruction on that scale. The absence of any visible enemy presence near the ruined positions only deepened the confusion, feeding rumors within their own ranks that something other than ordinary combat had unfolded on that ridge during the storm. Back at the base, soldiers who had spent the night bracing for what they believed would be their final stand emerged from bunkers and fighting positions into a morning quiet enough to feel almost unreal after the chaos of preceding hours. They walked the perimeter in stunned silence, staring out at a valley that should have been swarming with enemy forces and finding instead only abandoned equipment and the slow, steady drip of melting snow. No official explanation had yet reached them, only the single line later found scrawled into the after-action log by an exhausted communications officer working through the night. The words written there, simple and unadorned, would eventually spread far beyond that isolated valley and into the wider consciousness of the entire military command structure overseeing that winter campaign. The silent sniper, the note read, nothing more, nothing less. Yet it captured something the soldiers on that base already understood in ways official reports never could. The battle had turned not through overwhelming force or fortunate timing, but through the quiet, deliberate work of someone who had spent weeks being underestimated by everyone around her, and had spent one long winter night proving precisely how costly that underestimation could become. Word of what had happened at the outpost traveled quickly through command channels, prompting a visit that few on the base had ever expected to witness in person. A delegation arrived within days, led by senior officers whose presence alone signaled the significance of the events that had unfolded there, their arrival transforming the exhausted, battle-worn base into something resembling a formal ceremony grounds, despite the mud and melting snow still covering the ground. Soldiers who had spent weeks fighting for survival now found themselves standing in careful formation, uniforms hastily cleaned, awaiting a recognition none of them had anticipated needing to prepare for. The soldiers gathered that morning had spent the preceding days repairing what damage they could to the base, clearing debris left behind by weeks of siege, and preparing, almost disbelieving, for a ceremony none of them could have imagined attending only a short time earlier. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the scarred ground in a clean white layer that made the outpost look, for a brief morning at least, almost peaceful. The senior officers arriving from command moved through the base with visible curiosity, many of them clearly eager to see for themselves the young woman whose actions had already become the subject of quiet conversation throughout the wider military structure overseeing that campaign. She stood before the assembled officers with the same quiet composure she had maintained since her first day on the ridge, accepting the medal placed around her neck without any visible change in expression, as though the ceremony itself mattered less to her than the work that had preceded it. The soldiers who had once laughed at her arrival now stood at rigid attention, several of them unable to meet her eyes directly, the weight of their earlier dismissiveness settling uncomfortably against the reality of what she had accomplished in the weeks since. Sergeant Doyle, standing near the front of the formation, found himself the first to break ranks afterward, approaching her quietly to offer an apology that came out clumsier than he intended, though she accepted it with nothing more than a small, understanding nod. It was during this visit that her sealed file was finally opened under proper authorization, revealing details that explained far more than her extraordinary performance during the siege alone. She had, records showed, spent several years prior to this assignment, training elite reconnaissance units in advanced marksmanship techniques, though her own name rarely appeared in any official documentation of those programs. She had served as a tactical consultant on operations considered too sensitive for public acknowledgement. Her contributions folded quietly into broader mission reports credited to units and officers who never fully understood the extent of her involvement. Buried deeper still within the file were records of long-range shooting records that had never been publicly recognized, distances and conditions so extreme that the reviewing officers initially assumed clerical errors had inflated the figures before verifying them against independent witness testimony. She had built an entire career, it seemed, defined almost entirely by silence, her most remarkable achievements deliberately obscured from public record, precisely because revealing them would have made her an immediate target for enemies eager to eliminate or capture someone of her caliber before she could ever be deployed where she was needed most. The soldiers who learned these details felt something shift in how they understood the weeks they had just lived through. The mockery and doubt they had once directed toward her now recast against the reality of a woman who had quietly outperformed legends without ever once seeking acknowledgement for doing so. Colonel Briggs, reviewing the file alongside his fellow officers, found himself reflecting on how close he had come to relieving her from her post during that first chaotic engagement, and how differently that entire winter might have unfolded had he acted on his initial frustration rather than allowing her the space to prove herself in her own time and manner. He thought often, in the weeks that followed, about the thin margin separating disaster from the outcome they had actually witnessed, a margin defined not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by a single decision to trust orders he did not fully understand at the time they were given. It struck him as a strange kind of lesson for a career built on decisiveness, the idea that sometimes the wisest command decision was simply to wait, to withhold judgment, to allow silence the room it needed to eventually explain itself. He carried that lesson with him long after the base was decommissioned, applying it quietly to every unfamiliar soldier who crossed his path in the years that followed, never again assuming that quiet meant weak or small meant lesser. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, as reinforcements finally arrived and the siege that had trapped the base for so long came to its official close, something quieter than celebration settled over the surviving soldiers who had witnessed everything firsthand. The men who had once laughed at her arrival now spoke of her with a kind of hushed reverence, the sort typically reserved for figures who exist somewhere between memory and legend, Their earlier dismissiveness transformed into genuine respect for someone who had never once demanded it from them. A young private, newly arrived as part of the reinforcement contingent and unaware of the full history behind the woman soldiers now spoke of in careful, admiring tones, finally worked up the courage to approach her directly one quiet afternoon as the base began preparations for eventual reassignment. He asked, with the straightforward honesty only inexperience allows, why she had never simply explained herself during those difficult early weeks, why she had allowed the mockery and doubt to continue unchallenged when a few words might have spared her so much unnecessary hostility from soldiers who barely knew her. She considered his question for a long moment, the same quiet stillness she had carried since her first day at the base settling over her features as she reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and withdrew a small, worn photograph that had clearly traveled with her through many winters before this one. The image showed a younger version of the legendary marksman whose story had eventually reached every soldier on that base, standing in gear not unlike her own, his expression carrying the same quiet composure she herself had maintained throughout the entire siege. On the reverse side, written in handwriting worn nearly illegible by years of careful handling, were words that seemed to answer every question anyone might ever think to ask her. A true marksman speaks through precision, the faded inscription read, not through words. And she offered nothing further by way of explanation, tucking the photograph back into her jacket with the same careful gentleness she brought to every deliberate action the base had witnessed throughout that long winter siege. The young private, sensing somehow that he had received the only answer he was ever going to get, simply nodded and stepped back, understanding perhaps for the first time why the silence surrounding her had never been emptiness at all, but something closer to devotion carried forward across generations. When the time finally came for her to depart the base entirely, reassigned to duties that would remain, predictably, unspecified in any official record available to the soldiers she left behind, she offered no farewell speech, no final address to the men whose lives had been changed by her presence throughout that difficult winter. There was no gathering of cameras, no interviews granted to eager journalists who had begun circling the base, hoping to capture some official account of the woman already being called a legend throughout military circles. She simply gathered her equipment, said brief, quiet goodbyes to the handful of officers who had come to understand her during those weeks, and walked toward the waiting transport as fresh snow began falling gently across the valley one final time. The soldiers who remained watched her figure grow smaller against the white landscape, her footprints filling in behind her almost as quickly as she made them, until eventually there was nothing left to mark her passage at all beyond the memory each of them now carried forward from that winter. No parade awaited her wherever she was headed next. No headline would ever properly capture what she had accomplished during those long, silent weeks on that isolated ridge, and she seemed, by every indication those who knew her best could offer, entirely at peace with that quiet anonymity. Long after the base itself was decommissioned and the soldiers who served there scattered to postings across the world, the story of the woman known only as the Silent Sniper continued circulating through military circles in the particular way legends do, passed from veteran to recruit in barracks and mess halls far removed from the frozen valley where it had actually taken place. Few who told the story ever knew her real name, and fewer still could offer any accurate account of where she had gone or what she had done since. Yet the essential truth of what she represented remained remarkably consistent no matter how many times the details shifted in the retelling. She had arrived as an object of ridicule, dismissed by soldiers who measured worth by size and volume rather than skill and discipline, and she had left having quietly redefined what an entire outpost believed was possible from a single, determined person willing to let her actions speak more clearly than any words ever could. The mockery that had greeted her that first snowy afternoon became, in time, nothing more than the opening chapter of a story that soldiers would tell for years afterward, always ending with the same quiet observation about the small, silent figure who had changed the entire course of a war in the span of a single winter night without ever once raising her voice to prove that she belonged there all along.